In the last section, we started talking about the state system in React. Now, just talking about these rules is not super helpful, and it probably is not going to make a lot of sense until we actually write some code. So in this video, we're going to start to refactor our app component to make use of state. The first thing we're going to do is to make sure that we initialize our state when the component is first created. After that, we'll then make sure that we eventually make use of our state inside the render method, and then at some point in time in the future, we'll also make sure that we update our state with setState after we successfully retrieve our location. But that's just kind of a quick preview of what's going to go on. Let's actually get to it. All right, so I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. Now inside of our class component right here, we already have one method called the render method. That render method is required for every single React component we create. And one thing that I want to highlight is that that is a requirement of React. React says we have to define render. If we don't define this function right here, React is going to throw an error, and it's going to get angry at us and say, hey, you don't have a render method that's returning any JSX. There's another function that we can define inside of our class-based component. This is another very special function. It has a very special name, just as the render method right here has a special name. But this other function is not required by React, and it's more of a function that belongs to the JavaScript language itself as opposed to some very React-specific thing. The name of this function is the constructor function. So this is a specially named function that is particular to the JavaScript language, not specific to React. In a JavaScript class, the constructor function is the very first function that is going to be called anytime an instance of this class is created. So in other words, anytime that we create a new instance of the app component and show it on the screen, this constructor function is going to be automatically and instantly called before anything else. And so that makes it a very good location for us to initialize our state when our component is first created. Now, this is not the only way to initialize state. I'm going to show you another method of initializing state in just a moment, but for right now, we'll just stick with this way because you're going to see a lot of blog posts, documentation that shows you how to initialize state using this method right here. Now, when we define the constructor method, it's going to be automatically called with the props object. And yes, this is the same props object that we saw previously with our functional component. Before we do anything else inside this constructor function, we have to go through one little kind of ceremonial step. And I say ceremonial because it's basically just required of us. We have to do this. We have to call a function called super, and we have to pass in the props like so. So what is this super thing? You'll notice that we don't have any other function inside this file called super. So what is it? Well, remember, our app component is extending or borrowing functionality from the React component base class right here. This base class has a constructor function of its own that goes through some amount of setup or has some code inside of it to set up our React component for us. When we define a constructor function inside of our app class, we are essentially overriding or replacing the constructor function that is inside of the React.component class. But we still want to make sure that all the setup code inside of this thing's constructor function still gets called. So to make sure that the parents or React.component's constructor function gets called, we call super with props. Super is a reference to the parent's constructor function. That's all it is. So, like I said, this is a little bit of ceremony. We have to do it every single time that we define our constructor function inside of a class-based component. If we don't, we are going to very quickly see an error message that says, hey, you got to call super. And as a matter of fact, you know what? Let's just do it right now. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to save this file just so you can see this message really quickly. All right, and so as you'll see right here, we get this really nasty message. It says super hasn't been called. So essentially, we just have to put super with props in there, and then that error message will very quickly go away. Like so. All right, so now that we've defined the constructor, we can get on to business. The entire reason we defined that constructor function was so that we could initialize our state object. So in order to initialize our state object, underneath that super call, super is always going to be the first thing in here. So underneath it, I'm going to say this dot state equals an object like so. All right, so this object right here, that is our state object. It's going to eventually contain some different pieces of data, some different properties that are very important and relevant to our component that we're putting together. So like I mentioned previously, right now, the most relevant piece of data that we have is our latitude. So we might want to initialize our state object to include a property called latitude. Now we're going to abbreviate latitude as simply lat. So lat is short for latitude. When we initialize a property inside the state object, we're going to usually default it to some reasonable or sensible value. In this case, we know that our latitude is going to eventually be a number, like a decimal number. Whenever we want to eventually have a number as a property on our state object, but we don't have it yet, like at this point in time right here, we don't know what the latitude is just yet, we will usually default the value to be null. So a value of null means essentially we don't know what the latitude is yet. We will know eventually, but we don't know what it is right now. All right, so we're going to take a pause right here after saving this file. At this point, we have defined our constructor method, and we have initialized our state object by creating a JavaScript object, assigning a property or a key value pair to it, and then assigning the result of that to this.state. So let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to continue with this refactor of introducing state into our app component. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.